Anyway, let me start. Now, undoubtedly, this ongoing global pandemic, COVID-19, is creating havoc in all walks of life. The life in all countries has got disturbed, very disrupted, I would say. And we don't know how the future is going to unfold. It's probably going to be as bad or as good as it stands. Now, we are aware that this will have a serious ramification on international trade, being one of the major issues. Food and pharmaceuticals, medical devices are all in for to face a supply side shock. And this is evident from a number of export restrictions and other measures on such products that several WTO members have put in place since the advent of this global pandemic. Equally important to note the proposals put forward by countries like Australia and Singapore to the WTO in addressing such measures. Unless they are addressed in a balanced manner by taking into account all interests, such measures and countermeasures may spiral into a slippery slope of protectionism, resulting in spillover effects from supply to demand side shocks. As a result, other than immediate consequences such as loss of producer and consumer welfare, there will be a serious damage to the system of unilateralism, which has underwritten the security, peace, and prosperity of the world since the Second World War. Can we afford this to happen? Therefore, other than debating this broader role of the WTO in underwriting security, peace, and prosperity, this webinar will discuss the following specific questions for trade multilateralism under the aegis of the WTO to reinvent itself in a new avatar or reinvest itself. The first is creation of a critical mass of support for the European Union-Canada proposal for reforming the WTO dispute settlement system. If you are aware, the WTO dispute settlement is now in a limbo since the appellate body members were not confirmed by the body in view of the US recalcitrance. The second question is revival of the built-in agenda of the existing WTO agreements by advocating for greater transparency and participation in the functioning of the WTO's committees. Participation here I mean particularly LDCs, which always find it difficult to participate. And third and last is adoption of the values of the WTO agreement on trade facilitation for future negotiations. To please take off. We'll have about, I would request each panelist to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then so that we can get a lively question and answer session in about 1 hour's time. Thank you.
It's okay. I like to start by saying that not only what would happen to a world without the WTO question, but what would happen to the world at all in the next couple of years? Are we going to have a same world order that we've been having in the last couple of decades, things like that? I'm not so sure, because we will first have to deal with the pandemic across the board. It is very multilateral. It doesn't know any borders. So coronavirus, if it still lingers on anywhere else in the world, and the cure for the virus as early as possible in my own country, and I think elsewhere in the world as well. We believe that if you can't stop the pandemic, you can't begin even to look at how to revive the economy. I think it's a great risk when you go ahead and try to open up everything and open up wider and wider while the pandemic is still on. So I would say that we would have to be very cautious in the way we open up, and to resume the way we would be connected with each other around the world in our trading system. Now, I have seen various crises in the past, and with every crisis, like the financial crisis in Asia in the 1997-98 and the last Great Recession, 2008, the world would only recover when the global trading system would recover. It will not do so before that. No matter how much countries have been injecting huge amount of liquidity, but if people do not begin to really trade and invest, and investment, of course, will be derived from the expanding trading system, then we cannot actually have a full revival, rehabilitation of the global economy. So the same with this one. I mean, we are seeing some kind of revival of activities around some Asian countries. You look at China at the moment. China still exports, and it has actually seen some growth in its export, surprisingly. But the drop in import is more alarming. The drop in import in China is deep-seated, and it will go on. And it does mean that China's economy is not really fully recovering. You see around the world today that there are people who would like to revive the global trading system and to try to revive multilateralism by giving some support. You've seen the remarks made by former President Obama the other day. He was saying that now is the time to start developing a framework for global coordination. I thought it was true many years ago already, but he was re-emphasizing the thing for global coordination. I've just seen an article by Jared Diamond, Professor Jared Diamond, Diamond of Collapse and Upheavals, an article in Financial Times. And he was saying that this is something which is unprecedented. He said, until COVID-19, there has never been a struggle that united the world against a common enemy. I have seen a remark made by our colleagues, Executive Secretary of the UN Commission, Economic Commission of Africa, Ms. Vera Songwe. She said she's very much worried, and this is also the worry of the UN system, that there would be food crisis, but Ms. Songwe is worried that food inflation could spark riots across the developing world. And she is very much disappointed with the global response. She said, I quote, if we need an example of what the lack of multilateralism looks like, we are seeing it today. If one of us has a virus, all of us have it. My former employer, UNCTAD, has given out its own remark and point in the direction that advanced economies should pool their allocation of SDR. We should go for an immediate issuance of additional spatial drawing rights of around $1 trillion US. This is a recommendation by UNCTAD, and that advanced economies should pool their allocation of SDR and make them available to the poorest, so that they can use them in a way that we can finance a new trading revival. I can go on and on, but this just goes to point out that what we are seeing in the world today, that in spite of all the call for more unity, and people have been singing this song of John Lennon all over the world, the song Imagine, and with the lyrics of, I hope someday you will join us and the world would be as one. And I think the opposition, the controversy, the way that we are seeing things developing are not at all pointing in that direction that we are hoping for. Everywhere, and I think this is quite logical, you know, in the midst of the crisis, people tend to look at their own domestic crisis first, try to solve it, and some countries even go as far as to ban export of some key pharmaceutical products, medical equipment some time ago. Of course, we are now seeing better time with countries who have actually come out of the crisis beginning to help in sending some of these equipments overseas and things like that as well. But on the general trend, I have talked to several business associations around in Asia, and they told me that they are trying to convince our governments that let the government take care of their own businesses first. Let's them shorten the supply chain so that they will be closer to home, that we don't have to take the risk of running into another crisis like this. So people are looking more and more into isolationist stance and more very much reverse protectionist stance. Despite all this, I would end by saying that the WTO was created especially to deal with this sort of things. We remember the time during the interwar crisis in the 1930s when there was a major nationalistic trade policies, and there was fear that it could lead to another war, and it did lead to another war. But of course, in order to reduce political tension that we are seeing around the world today, besides the tension coming from the disease itself, we need somebody to help to mediate all this. We need more predictable atmosphere. We need at least to be able to have someone who can send out signals, warnings, to keep people away from doing the kind of export banning type or import restraints and things like that. To bring us back into the mercantilistic arena, which we don't want to have. We need to have dispute being resolved, and Pradeep has already referred to some of the proposal. We need to do it in any way we can, because there'll be more dispute coming up in the future, and now there's a lot of backlog on it. I can go on, but this is the WTO is only a place, although it may not be functional in the way we would like to see it function, but there are things that, particularly as of now, that the WTO can come in and give us some assistance. For example, the one that I have always said is to keep track, to help monitor the situation around the world and try to send out signals. To send out signals to warn countries to stay away from this protectionist stance. We need to have someone who can play the role of a mediator when new vaccine and new medicines are discovered, that they should be made freely available to the rest of the world, and not that poor country will have to come in and pay for the proprietorship, pay for the licensing of all these vaccines and medicine. And besides all this, because we are going to work more from home, we're going to be using online activities more so than in the past, I do believe that the WTO is the only place where we can bring some order to this a little bit confused world of digitization, because there are many countries, there are various huge, massive companies that are ruling the digital economy. And they're not controlled, they're not actually regulated by anybody. I don't mean that to keep them under strain, but at least to have some order, and the way they deal with governments around the world, and the way that taxation will have to be agreed upon, so that we would have reasonable participation of digital economy that we all can benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Supachai. I think a couple of important points which you raised was, one was the kind of a Marshall Plan approach to the poor countries through SDRs or what have you. I think that is very critical. And secondly, the last point which you made in terms of the dispute settlement system, I'll be glad to hear more about that from Kishore. Kishore, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pradeep, for inviting me to this discussion. And it's a particular honor to speak after Dr. Supachai, my friend, who's actually the real expert on this subject. But what I'm going to do is, before we narrow down to the specific issues, to talk a little bit about the larger global context, because we are, as actually Dr. Supachai just said, living in a very, very strange world. And we've got to understand the strangeness of the world if we want to find the solutions to the specific problems that you have raised, Pradeep. And I'm basically going to make 3 points. One is, of course, about why you need to have a global consensus. 2, what is the threat to this global consensus? And number 3, how we rebuild it again, and then solve these problems that you mentioned. And the first point to emphasize, of course, is that when people speak about trade, they always think of it in economic terms. But actually, as Dr. Supachai hinted just now, a few minutes ago in his remarks about what was going on in the 1930s, they realized as far back as then, 90 years ago, that essentially, if you want to preserve peace, you have to promote trade. And amazingly enough, the data shows very clearly, and I have a chart, I don't know that you can see it, and the top part is just, you look at it, how global trade has gone up, and the bottom part, how casualties from war have gone down in exactly the same period. There seems to be almost a direct correlation between growth in global trade and decline in deaths in war. So clearly, global trade has done more than just brought about prosperity. It's brought peace, and also, frankly, equally importantly, all the tremendous reductions that we have seen in global poverty are also a result of trade happening. Now, I want to emphasize that part because that brings me to my second point, which is very strange. If you can imagine, just imagine you are way back in 1947, 48, talking to the negotiators who are trying to set together GATT, and you tell the Americans in the room, you know what? 72 years from now, after we build this great system, global GATT and global trading system, the biggest threat to this global system will come from United States of America, and the biggest believer in global trade will be communist China. And if you had said that in the room in 1947, 48, the Americans would have laughed you out of the room and said, come on, you must be mad. The United States, the strongest, most self-confident country in the world, will always be the #1 defender of trade, and communist China was no way it can happen. So you can see what a strange world we have come to in the year 2020 is the exact opposite of the world in which WTO was first created at that time. And I want to emphasize this because the fundamental threat to the global trading system comes from the fact that the United States has lost its cultural confidence. The American people no longer believe that they can compete in international trade. And that's why the United States keeps not just walking away from GATT. The dispute settlement system is just a symptom of a larger problem, which is they feel that the international trading system, they cannot succeed, they cannot compete. And that's why, as you know, the United States will walk away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And by contrast, the country that is actually the most confident today when it comes to international trade, I would say by far is China. The Chinese believe no matter what, they can compete, they can succeed. And this was confirmed just, I think, a week or two ago when Premier Li Keqiang was speaking at the close of the 2 sessions, you know, the 2 big sessions, NPCPP and joint session of the Congress of the Parliament. Surprisingly, he was asked the question, would China consider joining the CPTPP? And everyone would thought, of course, China would say no. He said, no, we can consider it. And that's the difference we are at. And so we have to understand this fundamental transformation in the world to understand why the global trading system is so shaky today, because the #1 supporter has lost confidence in it. And what used to be the #1 opponent is now the strongest supporter of it. And of course, the more China supports it, especially in the context of a major geopolitical contest that's broken up between the US and China, which as you know, I document in my latest book as China Won. The more that China supports anything, the more the US will say no. And certainly when it comes to the World Trade Organization, the US will not listen to China. And here's, I just want to mention as an aside, I hope we come to that at some point in the discussion, the one place that could really try to fix the WTO would be the European Union. But the European Union, as we know, is itself in having its own challenges, its own problems. And it's basically, when it comes to dealing with the United States, the Europeans have a tradition of cowardice. They will never ever stand up to the United States, and certainly they're not stand up to the Trump administration. Although the one piece of good news I saw in the Financial Times today, and I hope it comes about, is that Europe and Africa are going to try and work together to nominate a candidate for the WTO, and that would be good. That would show, be a concrete signal that the developed world and developing world are agreeing on a candidate that hopefully would then be someone to be acceptable to both sides of the equation. So my third and final point, going back to your questions about the dispute settlement mechanism and others, frankly, it's not a case of trying to fix the mechanism. It's a case of trying to figure out how we rebuild the consensus in the World Trade, not just in the World Trade Organization, rebuild the consensus in terms of saying trade is good for the world, trade is good for humanity. And you know, the data is, by the way, not just global. I always like to say, for example, the one region in the world that has actually demonstrated the power of trade is ASEAN, Southeast Asia, where in ASEAN, surprisingly, where you had a group of countries that were initially in the 50s and 60s a bit frightened about opening up their borders and so on and so forth, over time have opened it up. And China, as you know, and Southeast ASEAN, as you know, has remained in the same period very peaceful. There have been no interstate wars again. And we even managed to bring in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos in. By contrast, and I hope you don't mind if I make this contrast, as you know, India and Pakistan have not had normal trade relations. And of course, there seems to be a correlation where they have fought at least 5 major wars, 48, 65, 71, 99, and then all these various incidents at Supachai. So that you can see again a correlation there. In Southeast Asia, trade grows, peace remains. India and Pakistan, no trade, and then you have conflicts. So the point of all this is that we actually, especially now in Asia, and I believe that the Asian countries clearly will be the biggest beneficiaries of growing international trade. We actually have to go back to basics, and ironically go back to the United States and say, actually, what you gave us was a wonderful global trading system. It's been good for you, been good for the world. Can we rebuild it instead of destroying it? And here, the last point I'm going to make is that, unfortunately, no Asian country or leader is willing to step up and say, I'll take on that role. And this is where I hope, as a result of your discussion, Pradeep, what we need clearly now is some kind of leadership from Asia. You are in the best position to stimulate it. I hope your discussion leads to some discussion of who in Asia can help to rebuild the system, including the dispute settlement mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kishore. I'm sure, I mean, in fact, we were talking about 21st century being the Asian century, and I wonder why there is not a single Asian claim on the DGWTO's vacancy position. I find it very surprising. But anyway, I suppose there are other political reasons behind it. Having said that, you made some excellent points, except let me, when you talk in terms of India, Pakistan, Kishore, don't forget that unlike ASEAN, South Asia was created out of India. To get my point in the sense that, you know, Pakistan and then Bangladesh came out of India. So it's a different dynamic totally. It's not the same dynamic as in ASEAN. So therefore, I will not get into that kind of thing. If we can get back to our original discussion on the issue that we are talking about, Supperamaniam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pradeep, and also thank you for inviting me for this panel session. I think both the speakers, Dr. Supachai and Kishore, have brought out very pertinent points and observations. But you know, having been a practitioner in the WTO, when one talks about WTO reforms, system, what needs to be done and all that, I think one area which is often neglected, and which I think is very important, and you know, there's the working practices of committees, the WTO subsidiary bodies, for example. You know, you and I know, and Dr. Supachai himself will know as well, we have a lot of committees, 21 committees, I think, at the moment, plus 5 working groups, not to mention the very specific groups which have been established to deal directly with negotiations. But when one looks at the work of the WTO subsidiary bodies, the committees, I find that very little constructive work is being done. Although the mandate is a little bit broader, it goes far beyond just looking at notifications, compliance, and so on. In fact, goes beyond that, you know, to help countries, especially developing countries. You mentioned about LDCs, for example. You can see that participation of developing countries in these committees has been very minimal, very, very minimal. You know, although that is the bread and butter of the officials, trade-based, officials based in Geneva, participation has been very minimal. And this is because of the lack of capacity, resources, and so on and so forth. But I think generally I would like to make this observation that we should not, I think one of the important components of the executive function of the WTO is actually performed by all these subsidiary bodies. You have the WTO Secretariat, and you had Dr. Supachai was the director himself, he knows that. And there are so many other committees, you know, which the WTO Secretariat services. But the question that we may have to ask is, are these working committees working? Is the full potential of these working committees being fully tapped? I regret to say that it has not been fully tapped, simply because the focus has been essentially on the implementation of commitments under the WTO agreements. You know, although the committees could do much more constructive work in terms of contributing to policy reforms, which will make the real difference in terms of the functioning of the WTO. And you know, I can say that the working practices of the WTO committees have been a major problem, you know, that the WTO is facing today. Why people are losing confidence or they're not so excited about, you know, WTO's performance is because if you look at the working committees, which should have actually contributed a lot in terms of reforms, were not forthcoming. So what we need to do actually is to examine once again, you know, in a very serious way, what should be the function of these WTO committees? How should they be restructured, for example, and how the working practices could be improved so that they not only look at notification requirements, but also help, especially developing countries, to cope not only with their commitments and to assess and evaluate what the implications of some of these commitments will have on the economic development of developing countries, especially LDCs, for example. This is not being done. You know, there's a lot of data that is collected through the monitoring process, but it is not being analyzed. It's not being analyzed, and you know, to help or to come out with some policy reforms. And in fact, I must say that some of our negotiations have been very difficult simply because you find that a lot of these issues, which are somewhat technical in nature, have not really been thought out in detail among the committees. If we can do that at the committees, for example, it will be less politicized, and we'll be able to resolve some of these trade problems specifically. That's not been done. Instead, everybody wants to take it to the dispute settlement mechanism. That shouldn't be the way. In fact, even the mediation, which Dr. Supachai is fully aware, why should it always be the establishment of panels and then an appellate body? I mean, there is that provision. There are provisions where, you know, the Director General himself can assume a role. There's the mediation aspect of it, which has not been really utilized in the WTO. What I'm trying to say is that, and the point that I'm trying to say is that WTO working practices in the subsidiary bodies of the WTO have to be relooked at as a matter of priority, right? And if this can be done, and there are a lot of weaknesses, for example, in the WTO committees today, you have lengthy discussions, very little progress, right? And then also representation in these committees, for example, more often than not, they are trade officials from Geneva based. There's very little participation coming from the capital cities. And the second aspect of it, that in some areas, when we look at in committees like technical barriers to trade, SPS, and so on and so forth, it cannot be just the work of the trade officials. You know, there are other stakeholders who have got other objectives, other mandate in a country, for example. They need to be invited, they need to be involved, you know, so that you see, the trade officials will look at it from the trade point of view. But you have, others, for example, look at it from the environmental point of view, from a health point of view, various safety point of view. These officials are very seldom participating in the committees in the WTO. So what I think we should be doing, among other things, is to have a more inclusive approach to the work that is being done, and not just restrict it only to trade officials, but also invite stakeholders from outside to come in and participate as well. Otherwise, you find that there is a shift now in terms of the shift is moving away from bargaining or market access and so on to more of regulatory cooperation. And regulatory cooperation would involve the participation of not just trade officials, or also officials of regulatory bodies in the respective national economies, for example. So I think, I really think that, we need to really look at the functioning of the WTO committee and see how they can contribute to the reform system that the WTO members are talking about. I don't think there's anything wrong with the WTO. It's a very good institution. It has served very well. And everybody has pointed out that trade is very important for all of us. But we also need to look at whether or not we can continue to operate the way we are operated under the Uruguay round, or on the Doha round. I mean, sometimes it's ideological. And then there's a sharp division between countries. We now have to have a look at it as a new paradigm. Shared partnership, shared vision. What is it that we want in the WTO? I'm sure if all countries can work together and not be very ideological, then we can, in a way, continue to make the WTO useful and beneficial to countries. But this is not being done. And I'm afraid that, I remember under the GATT days, before the Uruguay round, negotiations were very easy. One reason was that developing countries did not assume a very important role at that time. The developed countries played the part, but they never put pressure or demanded reciprocal concessions from developing countries, because they knew where the developing countries were in terms of their capacity, technological capacity, even industrial capacity, and so on and so forth. But the Uruguay round and then the Doha round, you find that there's a lot of demands being put on developed countries on developing countries who don't have the capacity. So when you follow that kind of an approach and push, then you're going to have a problem, right? So what I'm trying to say that I'm not saving the WTO. We can get the WTO to continue to be there, but continue to be more effective. I think we need to change. We need to change how we look at the work of the WTO, and how members of the WTO should be, working together on issues. And this again comes back to the work of the committees. Why should we allow agenda setting just by a few countries for negotiations? Why can't it be a bottoms-up approach to the top? The negotiating agenda can in fact be determined by the work of the various committees in the WTO. It's kind of part of the inbuilt agenda, discussing in detail policy issues, new developments, the implication, and what needs to be done to improve the trade regime, for example. This can be discussed by the various 21 committees and the rest. And if you have the right kind of people participating in it, capital-based officials and other officials from cooperation agencies and so on, this will then give rise to a number of issues that need to be discussed by the WTO in general. And some of it could even be negotiated. But these are being negotiated after having discussed this thoroughly at the exploratory stage. Instead of forcing countries to go undertake negotiations straight away, let us work and find out which are the ones which are ripe for negotiation. And I believe very strongly that if you can improve the working practices of the subsidiary bodies, they can, in a way, contribute to the negotiating agenda of the WTO, which will be more feasible and desirable. We will not get ourselves locked up in fighting each other and say that I want this, and there's no solution to that. So, in a way, I think what I'm trying to say, Mr. Chairman Pradeep, is that let us have a relook at the way the WTO subsidiary bodies are working at this point. And the Secretariat's role is extremely important. I've always felt that the Secretariat has been very, very good. They've helped us a lot. I personally worked a lot with them. They've been very helpful. But somehow, being a member-driven organization, the Secretariat, faces a lot of constraints for the members. We need to empower the Secretariat, and there are good officials there. They can do a lot of work. But right now, even the work of body subsidiaries, WTO subsidiary body, the WTO's assistance is somewhat minimal. But they can be asked to play a more active role, coming out with non-papers or with policy papers, analysis papers based on discussions in the WTO. They should be empowered to do this. And I think the members, if they really want the WTO system to function effectively and smoothly, let's also look at how we can sort of empower the WTO secretary. They have good people there. They can be used. And when I was director of the budget, Dr. Supachai, that was during Mike Moore's time, director of the budget, I had to deal with specific and stupid problems and issues related by countries. I don't want to mention a country. One country opposed the endorsement of the budget that was agreed by the budget committee. And I thought it was more fundamental. And I had to bring it up to the General Council for the endorsement. Otherwise, there's no money for the Secretariat. You know why? What the country, one developing country wanted? I had a private conversation with the ambassador. He said, my officials are not getting, places for training in the WTO. And therefore, I'm blocking this. It's ridiculous. This is ridiculous. It can be very difficult if countries, resort to trading, trading things like that. We have to look at the functioning of the WTO system in a very systematic way, in a very objective way, in order for it to move. So I just wanted to mention that because I'm saying that we have to deal with a lot of strange kind of, demands and all that. But I think all these things have to give way. But I still feel that if we focus, among other things, on the work of the subsidiary bodies of WTO, including the Secretariat, I think we can somewhat, make the organization more relevant, effective, and really meaningful to the members. Then we get the political participation of countries. So, there's so much that we can talk about, but time is a constraint. But I feel very strongly that let's also not forget that there is an important work that needs to be done at the level of the WTO subsidiary bodies, because they are not only doing work at technical level, they're also doing work at the policy level. And how do we get this going? Sharing of best practices, sharing of information, sharing of approaches in the various committees. All this could be collectively discussed and brought up to the General Council when they come out with the general report. The general report of the General Council is merely an indication of what the committees have done, but they don't go further to find out whether they've been effective in terms of their performance, and what kind of output they have come out with, in order that the international trading system can be looked at and see where the improvements are desired. So I'll stop here, Pradeep, but I may be later.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You remind me of the time when the WTO was established in Marrakesh. The general understanding or general feeling was that now it is a permanent negotiating forum. And the Doha round was never conceived as such. And the Doha round happened because of the desire by the US, particularly in order to tell the world after 9/11. If you remember, 9/11 was the cause for the launch of the Doha round. And they added the label called development in order to bring the developing countries on board. I still remember Robert Zoellick, then USTR, lobbying in Delhi and making these kind of speeches. And one could see very clearly the US was, rightly so, I would say, very desperate in order to send a signal to the world that the world is together, which goes back to the point which Kishore made in his own opening remarks, that the US was the body, the country which promoted WTO as the important sort of anchor for world trade or happening and in order to, and as it is as it's done. Secondly, in terms of the ideological issues, Supperamaniam, if you notice one thing, that there is increasing amount of variable geometry which is now taking place in the WTO, in the sense that there are plurilateral negotiations going on many issues, as calling them as coalition of the willing. So it is happening in a sense, whether or not we agree with it or not is besides the point. May I now invite Tanya? Tanya, over to you.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's been a wonderful panel to be a part of. I'm appreciating this immensely. I entered the Australian government when Supachai Panitchpakdi was in fact the Director General of the World Trade Organization, that period 2002 to 2005. And I have very positive memories of the beginnings of the Doha Development Round. So it's really a pleasure to be on this esteemed panel. I am the director of the Australia-India Institute and have been looking at the relationship between Australia and India in the Indo-Pacific context as we are more or less seeing the rise of Asia in the 21st century. But in my previous career, I also represented Australia as a negotiator at World Trade Organization negotiations. And it was my particular privilege to have been part of the Declaration on Access to Medicines, which demonstrated that the WTO could in fact commit to permanent exceptions, in that case to the patent exception, Article 31F of TRIPS, to allow for access to medicines and exports. And I also negotiated on Friends of Environmental Goods. So for this panel, as we consider what would the world look like without the WTO, I want to think about what is the world, what would we like the world to look like, full stop? And then how does international trade fit into that picture? And then contemplate the context in which the WTO was negotiated. We've touched on that with the previous speakers here on the panel, but I think it's worth remembering where we've come from. So we've spoken about, obviously, the 25 years of the World Trade Organization, but I want to take us back now to a speech made by Henry Morgenthau, the US Secretary of the Treasury, on the 1st of July 1944, when the Bretton Woods negotiations were happening. So a quote from his speech as he was chairing the Bretton Woods meeting. "All of us have seen the great economic tragedy of our time. We saw the worldwide depression of the 1930s. We saw currency disorders develop and spread from land to land, destroying the basis of international trade and international investment and even international faith. In their wake, we saw unemployment and wretchedness, idle tools, wasted wealth. We saw their victims fall prey in places to demagogues and dictators. We saw bewilderment and bitterness become the breeders of fascism and finally of war. In many countries, controls and restrictions were set up without regard to their effect on other countries. Some countries, in a desperate attempt to grasp a share of the shrinking volume of world trade, aggravated the disorder by resorting to competitive depreciation of currency. Much of our economic ingenuity was expended in the fashioning of devices to hamper and limit the free movement of goods. These devices became economic weapons with which the earliest phase of our present war was fought by the fascist dictators. There was an ironic inevitability in this process. Economic aggression can have no other offspring than war. It is as dangerous as it is futile. We know now that economic conflict must develop when nations endeavour separately to deal with economic ills which are international in scope. To deal with the problems of international exchange and of international investment is beyond the capacity of any one country, or of even any 2 or 3 countries. These are multilateral problems to be resolved only by multilateral cooperation. Now, the reason to read this quote, it's quite lengthy, but it gives you a sense of, in time, why we came together in the first place in 1944. And strangely, we see that a lot of the perils that face the world exist today. So in some ways, we are truly repeating history in terms of the dynamics that we are facing. And yet we are resorting to the same mechanisms that brought us to the brink of despair in the late 1930s and 1940s. It beggars belief that such intelligent leaders can come full circle and again question the very multilateral consensus order that brought us together to the amount of peace and prosperity we have managed to achieve in the decades that we have just had. So why this threat is a question I ask myself. It is not merely the WTO that is under threat. We know now that for the last 5 years or so, it's multilateralism as a whole that has been under strain. It's the International Monetary Fund, it's the World Bank, it's the United Nations order, as we've seen with the World Health Organization and other institutions as well. So in order to think about why the WTO is affected and what the world would look like without it, I think we need to understand why multilateralism as a whole is coming under strain and what the world looks like without this consensus. Now, in some ways, amusingly, ironically, and quite sadly, it probably wouldn't look that much different because institutions are only as strong as the credibility that they have. So as individual states act in ways that undermine the credibility of organizations and institutions, we see that that alone creates a problem with being able to follow these institutions, and it affects their strength, their ability, and their capacity to function. As we know, the World Health Organization came under stinging attack by the United States for the way that coronavirus was dealt with. But the problem that we all fail to see is that it's not necessarily only the fault of organizations. For organizations, as we all know on the panel, are only the aggregate of states that have committed and consented to this organization taking forward. A state's power is in its member states, and the member states following the rules that we have all agreed to be bound by. Clearly, the World Trade Organization needs to be looked at. And on one positive note, I suppose, is the idea that we all have consensus on one thing. Reform is required. The question, though, is then what kind of reform is required? Now, the United States and others have been talking about the need for greater discipline among developing countries, and in particular singling out countries as like India and China, who are in fact now in the top 5 of the global economies, at least in terms of GDP, obviously not in terms of per capita. So the US wants to see a rollback of special and differential treatment and a more level playing field. But I quite agree with my predecessor that this in part on the panel is to do with the cultural confidence that the US is having, that it no longer believes that it can succeed in competition. Now, unfortunately, it does not seem appropriate to create rules for a game that you think only you can win. And at the point that other players start to perform strongly, you decide you no longer want to play by the rules and perhaps want to withdraw and umpire altogether, as the United States has clearly done. But when we look at what's being asked for in terms of reforms, we've also heard on the panel today that we need to look at efficiency. We need to look at the dispute settlement system. Obviously, there's an interim agreement in process now for an appellate body to be bound by a plurilateral group within the WTO. And we've seen at least, still a positive functioning with the tobacco dispute appellate body outcome announced just yesterday. But here we need to break down what it is that's required. So on one level, we have systemic issues. On another, we have representational issues. So some developing countries are calling for greater representation within multilateral format, including within the WTO as well. For others, again, we talk about the representation of values within the system itself. So we know that in 1995, TRIPS, often a quite contested pillar, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, somehow, was constituted a part of free and liberal trade. But this was only the value system and the legal system of a certain set of countries, while others had to start adopting intellectual property rights and enforcing them on pain of becoming a WTO member. So do other values also need to be represented? But these issues are all the contest between states. We then have 2 other big shifts between the 20th century and the 21st century. These are, of course, the global order itself. all of us on the panel today have spoken of the United States, and we're speaking of a world in which many of these institutions were created, including the WTO, in a unipolar setting. We've now gone through a bipolar and into a multipolar world, and this necessarily must be represented in the institutions. It is understandable that as countries rise to power, as in India, Turkey, China, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia, start to take more ownership of the leadership objectives and the leadership roles in the world, that they also have greater representation in institutions and in the values that they have also. Apart from multipolarity, the final difference we have, of course, are the problems themselves. So when Henry Morgenthau was speaking in 1944, he was speaking of a world of economic crisis, also brought on by war. Here, we again have struggles of ego in a strongman 21st century, but in addition, we have genuine pointy-end environmental challenges that have become utterly unignorable. Climate change must be addressed. We have, as the Honourable Supachai Panitchpakdi pointed out, human health pandemics, and currently the coronavirus crisis that is affecting every single country in the world right now. We also have, unignorably, the rising nationalism and rejection of multilateralism from many countries coming up. And this really needs to be addressed as a problem, not ignored and being told we must be focused on consensus, but try and unpack why it is that nationalism has reared its head again when it seems so utterly illogical and against the rationalization of our own, the maximizing of our own well-being. And finally, we see that services and cybersecurity will be much bigger parts of our trade internationally than the simple movable goods that we saw in the 20th century. So in terms of what we're dealing with, these things have changed. So when I think about the WTO, I think sometimes that maybe it's optimism that has been our downfall. I believe the WTO has functioned very well. When we think about the world before 1995, of course, we had the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, but what we had were expert panels without enforceability. Developing the WTO has meant not only the dispute settlement element, but consensus on a number of other issues as well, including the General Agreement on Tariffs and Services, GATS, and intellectual property, among many others. And of course, others on the panel have referred to the various committees and working groups that are currently underway. But we were so enthused and energized by what we achieved in 1995 that I think our optimism almost broke our own backs. 1998, we rushed to the San Francisco round only to realize that protests prevented it. The Doha round in the year 2000 commenced extremely ambitiously without any real noting of the success of bringing so many countries together to achieve what actually was achieved, one of the strongest, not just trading systems, but enforceable trading systems, one of the strongest legal international mechanisms in the world. But we've only noted our failures rather than celebrating our successes. And that mood of failure, I feel, has permeated through the institution over the last 20 years, when there is actually so much to celebrate. We could celebrate the fact that we have, in fact, created transparency. Yes, states have been perhaps not as forward-looking as they should when it comes to notifying changes to their trade policies. You know, some are very much lagging behind when it comes to their notification obligations, but it still happens. And we can still demand states to be transparent about their subsidies, their tariffs, their changes. The dispute settlement system has created a more level playing field. Is it equal? Of course not. But is it better than not having any mechanism? It seems to me that the developing world has actually made use of the dispute settlement system almost in as heavy percentages as the developed countries in terms of being demanders of the system. And this to me is also a mark of success. Afghanistan, I think, was the most recent country to join in 2015, which again demonstrates that the World Trade Organization can be an awkward umbrella for all of us. We need to try and be a bit more of a global family. And as we all know, families doesn't mean that we agree all the time. So perhaps it is consensus that is starting to break our backs. But we do need to look at the system. At the time, and it is still true, that trade and economic integration is critical for all of us to thrive and to benefit and be prosperous. But more is needed than that. I believe that we need to relook at things like Articles 20 and 21 of GATT and their equivalents in GATS. So far for human health and for the environment, we have just the exceptions, Articles 20B and G. These are exceptions to the rule, but arguably sustainability needs to be more front and center in a 21st century trading system. And unless we use mechanisms like a WTO, I think it will be very challenging to truly commit to the environment and to climate change. Instead of having an environmental goods agreement in the margins of trade, we should be pushing sustainability as an obligation of trade. Similarly, for health, we may want to restructure whether or not these are exceptions to the rule, or rather become positive obligations of global trade. This is ambitious, but we're now in a world that I think invites ambition and an aggressive relooking at what needs to be done. We are tinkering at the precipice of great change. Now is not the time to tinker at the edges. It is the time to ambitiously address what needs to be done. And I think we have the right minds around this panel to do it and to reflect exactly what the 21st century demands of multilateralism. We must also be mindful of what it is we are wanting to achieve. We must be more committed to outcomes than to institutions. If some of our 20th century institutions need to become casualties in the process in order to rebuild credibility in a 21st century where powers have changed and reformed, so be it. We unfortunately lost the League of Nations, which was meant to bring the world together after the First World War, but we gained the United Nations just after the Second World War. As we all know, we never achieved the ITO, the International Trade Organization, as part of the Bretton Woods because time wasn't ready yet. What we ended up with decades later was a World Trade Organization. And if this no longer serves our purpose, perhaps it even makes sense to be ambitious and rethink about a GTO, a global trade organization that embodies the global issues of the 21st century, including human health, environmental goals, and cybersecurity upfront as serious issues. We've seen, obviously, Article 21 be misused in terms of national security being abused in bad faith. We've seen Article 24 almost become redundant in terms of RTAs. And I think it's time that we really look at what it is we want to fundamentally change in order to gain true buy-in and consensus. And in doing that, it's a lot harder to voice your opposition to an organization that you have been upfront and center part of the creation of. So these are some quite probably out of the box ideas, but I would just want to leave the panel with those before we get into our questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And may I now turn to Bipul Chatterjee to particularly address the last question that I raised, that can the WTO trade facilitation agreement be a good model for any future agreements? Bipul, over to you.
Thank you. Let me first thank all the panelists for their thoughts. I think we need to look at this issue of trade facilitation, not just in terms of an agreement per se, but more in the holistic sense of what we have heard since morning. We have heard about Dr. Supachai speaking about it's not just geographic proximity, for example, is going to be very, very important for value chains. So it is in this context, I think we need to look at trade facilitation, not just, as I said, not just in terms of an agreement or provisions therein, but more in the context of how we can do trade in a much better manner, in a manner which can help various stakeholders to understand the values which trade are bringing to their lives, not just to their balance sheets. That's something which we need to ponder over. And the beauty about the, now let me come to the agreement part. The beauty about these points, since the Singapore Ministerial Conference in 1996. And all member countries, they have shown interest including some of those countries who are otherwise negotiating quote unquote new issues. I'm not taking the name of countries, but in this case, all member countries, they have shown their interest in negotiating this subject for the simple reason that they realize the values that it can bring, and not just in, as I said, not just in terms of uh, monetary values, but the overall values that trade facilitation can bring to our lives. So we can have better access to goods and services, which otherwise is difficult to access. I mean, we have to pay more. So this very strong consumer dimension of trade facilitation was also evident as we have seen the negotiations of that substance. The unfortunate part is that it is yet to be implemented. The required number of countries ratifying it. But let me end at this point of time. I think we should also have sufficient time for questions and answers. By underlining one particular feature of this agreement is that I think it's a different kind of an agreement than the other WTO agreements or GATT agreements, that here we have given the options to countries about their commitments, about their obligations, as per their needs, as well as per their, capacities. And there is enough flexibility. I think when you talk about the future of the system and the issues which we are going to deal with, I tend to sort of agree with what Tanya has just said, that trade is not just about some exchange of goods and services. It is also about certain values, and we need to bring those values back to not just in negotiating table, but first in our minds, and then see how we can take those values forward. So on that note, let me stop here, but by saying that this trade facilitation is definitely something which we can look at much more closely to see that how we can negotiate trade with values in future. So let me stop here. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bipul. And now may I request the host to please read out the questions, if any, that he might have received from the audience.
Yeah, we've received several of questions. I'll take it one by one to the respective speakers. I'm Wto Mehta. I work with Kutch International. The first question is for Dr. Supachai. Considering that the pandemic has broken global supply chains, which are vital to world trade, and there's also growing move for national self-reliance in many countries, what will be the future of the world trade? And are WTO institutions adapting to the emerging scenario? So the question, over to you, Mr. Supachai.
Yes, what we are seeing today is that the situation on the global supply chain is in a state of flux. There are countries around the world that are now deliberating as to how they can actually transform the supply chain to be more or less manageable in their own region. For example, if you look at the ASEAN economic community, we're looking at the opportunities that the community could be able to attract the kind of supply chain that could be centered around the connectivity within the ASEAN areas, instead of linking up beyond ASEAN, even into China and somewhere else, because there remains a big risk that the chain might be broken during times of crisis. So we are seeing a bit of a contraction of the spread of the supply chain a little bit. We don't see a disappearance of the supply chain, but we are seeing the supply chain being contracted, being drawn closer to home within the region of joint economic integration effort. We're seeing also the movements of some companies out of certain areas which used to be the hub the supply chain. For example, companies moving out of China, companies moving out of the United States so that they could be somewhere else closer to places of their own sourcing of raw materials and where they can safely establish the security of their people and things like that. I have heard talks, and this is from India, I have heard talks that India and US have been having some discussion on supply chain between Indian and US American companies, particularly US companies that are located in China, for example, to bring those companies out of China to be relocated in India. And I was told that the Indian government is offering a lot of incentives for this to happen. And so I guess that there will be still the existence of supply chain. It will still be there. But the way that supply chain will be managed will be tighter, will be more done on a digital basis. So, I mean, a lot of things, three-dimensional technology could help to do it more close to home or at home as well. We are seeing that the regional, the deep regional integration could bring in the kind of attract the supply chain to the region as a whole and to create their own supply chain.
Thank you, Mr. Supachai. The next question is for any of the panelists who would like to take this. What is the view of the panelists on the questioning of developing country status of countries such as China, India, and Brazil by a few WTO members, including by the US? The question is from Mr. Sridhar to any of the panelists who would like to take this. Yes, Mr. Kishore.
Well, it's a tricky question, but I will take it. And the reason I'm taking it is that I think many developing countries are not aware of how much the world has changed. You know? And I'm glad that Tanya read out the wonderful statement from the US Secretary-Treasury Morgenthau, because it showed the generosity of spirit that the US had at the time. We must have a strong multilateral world. And I can tell you, as recently as 1985, when Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the former Prime Minister of Singapore, gave a speech to the joint session of Congress, he said, America is a great nation moved by high ideals. Only the elevating power of idealism can explain the benign manner in which America has exercised its enormous power since the end of World War II, and the magnanimity and generosity with which it has shared its wealth to build a more prosperous world. So American generosity was a major driving force in the world and enabling this global multilateral order to emerge. And the one big fact we have to accept is that the American people are no longer ready for such generosity. And Donald Trump, in many ways, for all his flaws, captured the essence of what America wants today. It is make America great again. In 1944, America wanted to make the world great again. Today, in 2020, America only wants to make America great again. And so, you know, when we keep saying we developing countries, we must get special rights, special favors and all that, I mean, in theory, I completely agree. But it's a world in which there's no longer generosity. You have to adapt to the real world, and you cannot change that real world. So for a start, in fact, I've argued in my book, As China Won, that one of the strategic mistakes that China made was not to unilaterally give up some of the concessions it got from WTO in 2001 when it joined WTO, because it got the concessions which it deserved. It was a developing country then. But since then, in 2001, China's GNP was 1/8. American GNP was 8 times the size of China in 2001. Today is 1.5 times. So all the concessions that were offered to China when it's 1/8 the size, you've got to discuss whether or not they should still remain valid. And I think, frankly, it is in China's national interest to progressively release some of these concessions and say, okay, we will work with you. Yes, I mean, it is a fact, by the way. China's per capita GNP is 10,000 and United States 60,000. But despite that, frankly, there's a greater sense of generosity today in China than there is in the United States of America, vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Now, when it comes to India and Brazil, it gets a bit more complicated. I think clearly in the case of India, I hope our Indian colleagues will speak out their views, because Supachai has hinted something very, very important. There is a new kind of implicit alliance developing between India and United States, okay? And you put that on the table. There's a kind of geopolitical alliance that's developing here. And in theory, by the way, as you know, when China implicitly became a geopolitical ally of United States in the Cold War, China was showered with so many gifts. Why do you think China has grown so fast over the years? Because the Americans opened their markets to China and say, come in China, you can grow and we love you and please grow with us. Unfortunately for India, you've decided to become a geopolitical ally in some ways of the United States at a time when America is the opposite. It is now not generous at all. And so you don't get the benefits that China got from being a geopolitical ally of the United States. Because basically entry into the American market is what enabled China to grow so fast. And in the same way, in theory, America should be opening up its markets to India. And if it did that, frankly, that would be a good thing for India, good thing for United States, and it would be good for the world also. But unfortunately, as you know, it was quite shocking the way President Trump, I think, threatened India when COVID-19 broke out. I forget what the issue was. He actually called and said, if you don't do X, I will do Y, kind of thing. And that was a threat that was given, even though at the time when India and the United States are moving closer together. So I'm telling these stories because the developing countries, if they really want to survive in a much more difficult world, a world without Morgenthau, then frankly, they got to understand the new realities. They can no longer make the demands on the West, on the developed world that they did before. And they got to work for different kinds of arrangements whereby they benefit and the West also benefits. That's what we need to do. Thank you.
Pradeep, can I make a comment on that?
Please do.
Yeah, no, I think the issue the question that was raised was in respect of the status with developing countries and developed. In the WTO, what we accept or recognize formally is developing, and LDCs. LDCs has got a separate kind of categorization. But I think it has a lot to do with the special and differential treatment. We recognize, of course, a lot of things have changed. A lot of developing countries have reached a state of development where, like, for example, US is unhappy with China because it seems to be also having a free ride in terms of S&D provisions, which, as you know, are generally applicable to all developing countries, including LDCs. I think my own view is that the special and differential treatment provisions will have to stay because they're quite sensitive, right? They're quite sensitive in the WTO, and also the levels of development, even within countries, can vary in terms of growth and so on and so forth. But what I think would be a more feasible approach to overcome this problem of differentiation is when we negotiate some issues, that some will be very issue specific, meaning that some countries will be able to manage without the preferential treatment, without the S&D, but others cannot. It has a lot to do with policy space. We all talk about policy space in the WTO. So there has to be some recognition. And therefore, when we negotiate, like for example, I'm not so sure, I think in fisheries agreement or something like that, or even subsidies agreement, we have in fact carved out countries which are eligible for the subsidies. Others are not, in terms of their per capita income and things like that. So I think there are some examples which should appear in some of the WTO agreements. So I do not think that there will be any way to get developing countries to do away with special and differential treatment. That is definitely not on. Because for them, policy space is important. But what we can do is when we negotiate issues, we can try to differentiate countries which we can undertake which can enjoy those privileges, concessions, and others cannot, right? So it's going to be a difficult, and this is not something that is new. We have discussed this for years in the WTO, in other fora, and so on and so forth. But I, as a former practitioner, I don't think, because it's very sensitive, categorizing countries in relation to S&D is not going to be easy. But what is possible is let's look at issues when we negotiate and what kind of policy space, for example, we can accord to some countries. But the language can be such that it automatically excludes certain developing countries. So I think giving up concessions, for example, like China, it's okay in market access, or even India and US working very closely. It will be more in terms of opening up their markets and so on and so forth and all that. That is possible. But when it comes to these S&D provisions within that international organization like the WTO, that's a different cup of tea. I think we need to look at it in a very objective, dispassionate way and see how we can address this problem. Because US is not happy with China, for sure. They are not. They want China not to qualify for S&D provisions. A blanket provision like that, I think, is not so practical. So I think WTO members will have to find a way, to deal with this special and differential treatment in the WTO.
Thank you. Thank you, Supperamaniam. Kishore, let me go back to the point which you raised about the US threat made to India. I mean, between India and US, of course, there is a geopolitical relationship which is getting closer day by day, along with Australia and Japan as a quad. Now, the goal is very clearly to contain China. What US has been threatening India again and again, it was not only on the export of the medicine, which is a malarial medicine called hydroxychloroquine.
That's right.
Now, that was not something which is really the best cure for dealing with COVID-19, but this is how. Now, I mean, Trump sort of takes up an issue and makes it a great issue always. And like Harley-Davidson tariffs in India was so high that he made a big issue out of it, and again and again. I mean, he does that intentionally. Now, when you talk in terms of the US issues in relation to China, Supperamaniam, the fact is that China was able to take a lot of advantages from the WTO agreement, and that is what has irked US. For example, the state-owned enterprises, the kind of national subsidies, hidden subsidies which are existing in China and making them more competitive, is something which has been a bane for the US as such. This is what Trump wanted to change. And as Kishore rightly said, I mean, the generosity has come down because of the kind of the downsides of globalization in the US and many other countries, which is indeed another issue, which is causing a lot of discomfort with the WTO as such, that WTO being the instrument for globalization as perceived by a very large number of people, if not all. On the other hand, the fact is that when we are discussing about this particular issue about, can the world do without a WTO? I don't think it can. What is it that we need to do? And Tanya has made some very good suggestions in that area. Though, of course, there is a contradictory positions taken up by Supperamaniam also, in the sense that when you talk in terms of policy space, or when you talk in terms of ideological issues, whether it's labor or environment and so on, and this is something which has always been a bugbear for like India, Malaysia, and China as well. That you can't bring in non-trade issues into the trade agenda. And you have to keep it a very pure trade issue as far as progress is concerned. And that will remain constantly on the sort of on a boiling point. Having said that, let me go back to the panel and invite Bipul, who's raised his hand. Bipul? Tanya, you want to come in?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, after Bipul. Bipul?
Sure.
Yeah, 2 points very quickly. First is on the last one, which you have underlined. I mean, drawing from what Tanya has said earlier. It is absolutely, and also what Ambassador Supperamaniam has said, it is absolutely important that we should not conflict non-trade issues with trade per se. Particularly in respect to trade sanctions, I would underline this point. At the same time, we have to understand, I would quote unquote understand the values, let's say environment or various other welfare measures. The linkages between those values and the values that trade can bring to our lives. And this is what I was emphasizing on our lives, not just on our companies' balance sheets. That's something which I think we need to ponder over much more seriously and much more carefully than what we used to do in the past. But definitely not as per sanctions approach. That can backfire, which we have seen in respect to both labor and environment in the past. My second point, and again very briefly, is what Dr. Mahbubani has said about this new geopolitics which is emerging. The situation is such that the United States, they have left the space for whatever reasons. There are various theories about it. China is very keen to enter into that space. But the question is whether middle powers are how middle powers are thinking about it. Middle powers like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, I'm talking about this part of the world, about China. So it's a classic example of, I think, the Kindleberger trap, which we are witnessing as we speak. And it is much more difficult nowadays because of various development with respect to China's behavior. You call it with Australia, for example, in South China Sea, in our northern part, in our Ladakh region. So we are not sure about how we are going to deal with those kind of a situation. But on your point about India getting more and more aligned, if I may use that word, with the United States, I think the jury is still out. We are following strategic autonomies as far as our foreign policy is concerned. And I think we'll continue to follow strategic autonomies in various dimensions of taking forward our foreign policy objectives. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Tanya, before I come to you, Uday, are there any other questions?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions, but I think Tanya has been waiting for a long time. So maybe we can take Tanya and then we can come back to the flow.
Okay, but we have now limited time, another 5 minutes to go. Tanya, over to you.
Sure. So just quickly on the issue of generosity, I quite agree with Kishore that we've moved from an America that wanted to make the world great again to an America that wants to make America great again. But I think this limited ideology completely forgets the idea that in order to make any one nation great, we need to be collective. In terms of whether generosity exists in the world, I would say that it does. It's just not in the United States at the moment. France and Germany have been playing very strongly a leadership role, and India has stood shoulder to shoulder with Merkel and Macron. So there's been calls to a Friends of Multilateralism started by France and Germany last year, which India has joined. Some of the phone calls that Prime Minister Modi made in March and April when the pandemic struck were to France and Germany to discuss a human-centric multilateralism, which Prime Minister Modi has been very vocal about. And we've seen New Zealand's Jacinta Ardern speak about kindness on the floor of the United Nations General Assembly as something that needs to drive all of us. So I would say that generosity is alive and well. It's just not in its original parts. France and Germany also risked sanctions from the United States to export medical supplies and food to Iran when it was at the height of its own coronavirus, which I think really is about reaching out and making sure that people are taken care of in need. So that's just on generosity. I think it does exist, and I think we need to make more of it. In terms of special and differential treatment, I think we need to be mindful not to fall into a prisoner's dilemma. It's easy to fight against an opponent, but what we need to do is rise to an idea or an ideal. And I think we need to have our eyes on the world that we want to be, and we can do it. A previous example is the access to medicines I was talking about. This was in fact India's ingeniousness again. Article 31F of the TRIPS agreement was about whether or not you could export patented medicines that were under Crown license in order to deal with a pandemic or an emergency. And 31F constrains that by saying, well, you can't export. You can do Crown license of medicine in a pandemic, but if you're exporting, then it must be for some kind of, economic benefit. And in this case, it completely forgot the idea that maybe a country doesn't have the technological base to create its own medicine. So it's going to be reliant. Côte d'Ivoire may not be able to produce hydroxychloroquine, for example, if it needs to. And so countries were able to come together, not just in generosity, but in realization that pragmatism must win the day for any state to function. In order to break this prisoner's dilemma, in a different forum, India has managed to do it once again, and this is in the form of the International Solar Alliance. Up until then, we had an S&DT equivalent in the common but differentiated responsibility idea in the environment discussions. And in that, the International Solar Alliance has kind of broken that north-south divide of common and differentiated responsibility by saying, yes, developing and least developed countries can act, but again, let's be pragmatic. We need to share technology transfer properly and green finance properly. So if the issue is about enablement, instead of insisting on the rights of an exception, which quagmires everyone into the lowest possible form, let's insist instead on the highest. Let's be outcomes focused. And if the outcome is to solve the environment together, well, then let's equip people with capability. And that's the point of technological transfer and green finance. So it's really about creative alternatives to break a false dichotomy. And I think that we can be creative to achieve these things. Lastly, am I just banging on about ideological issues instead of recognizing a real politic or a policy space? To that, I would just say, well, environment is a trade issue. Health is a trade issue. We started this panel by saying that coronavirus has in fact interrupted global supply chains. How is that not a trade issue? Climate change will also affect supply chains, as tsunamis and other things have already done. So I think we also need to reevaluate our false duality. It's not body versus mind or trade versus environment. They are in fact one and the same. And the longer that we divorce them out, the longer we won't actually be able to deal with the issues that are before us in an outcomes way.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, can I turn to Dr. Supachai? Supachai, for your last word before we conclude this event.
I would like to say this. A number of years ago, there was an American professor by the name of Rudiger Dornbusch. He's already passed away. But he came to Davos meeting and he made a very strong pronouncement. He said, this is the moment the cat is dead. No, the cat is dead. But a few years after that, actually it wasn't dead. It was reborn into even a more powerful organization called the World Trade Organization. So this time around, although somebody is saying that the WTO is a catastrophe or over-litigated organization or whatever criticism that has been leveled on the WTO, I do believe that in order to come out of the crisis, disease crisis, into economic crisis, and to get out of all this, we need to be able to get trade in order. And in order to get trade in order, Fidel Castro once said to me, I love the WTO because it helped bring order to a chaotic world. And in the future world, it's going to be really chaotic. So we need to bring order, and whatever we do, reform or no reform, we will need a multilateral organization like the WTO, the WHO, and the UN to function well, period.
Thank you very much. And can I now bring this event to a closure? Thanking Dr. Supachai, Dr. Mahbubani,
Thank you.
Ambassador Supperamaniam, and Tanya for this excellent event. As we wrote to you earlier, this is the second in the series of events that we are doing, and we'll be shifting the event, the same thing again and again. This all began on the first day, the first time that we held this event, when our former Trade Minister, Suresh Prabhu, suggested that we should write a paper on this particular subject. So the idea is this, that in order to write the paper and also to raise an issue which I think is very important for all of us, as very, very nicely summed up by Dr. Supachai when he quoted Fidel Castro, that in order to bring order to a chaotic world, we require a WTO. With that, let me thank you all once again. And we'll be doing 2 more of these events in Africa and in Western Hemisphere and Europe particularly. So by that end of this series, by July or so, we'll be able to come out with a paper which will be sending you a draft for your valuable comments. And with that, thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Actually,
Thank you.
I was telling somebody that, you know, the Indian and the Thai style
Yes.
of salutation
This is the best way.
going to be the norm now. No more hands.
Yes. No more shaking hands.
No more shaking hands.
Yes.
No more hugging.
Yeah, okay.
I'd like to thank the audience also for listening to this discussion very carefully. This has been recorded also, and you'll be able to see it later. With that, thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.